Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank you all for spending your Sunday listening to talks about Spinoza, and to thank our morning speakers, and to remind you that after this session there will be a break, and then the highlight of the conference, a lecture by Professor Jonathan Israel from Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. His two 1,000-page books, Radical Enlightenment and Enlightenment, the contested hot off the presses from Oxford University Press, are both for sale in our bookshop, in the Center's bookshop, as well as I saw the Leo Strauss book by Professor Smith and several books by Professor Nadler. I think we have the whole trinity of Spinoza books. And right. I'm going to begin today with the story of the genesis of my interest in this peculiar question of Spinoza's image in Yiddish literature. It's not an obvious shidduch. It's not an obvious area of interest for Yiddish writers. A Dutch and Portuguese Sephardic son of Marranos, who was excommunicated from the Jewish community, becomes resurrected in the imagination of 19th and early 20th century Yiddish writers and poets and playwrights. How did this happen? And how did I even find out about it? I had no knowledge of it, and nothing really has been written about it yet. It was 1977, and I was attending a seminar in Widener Library at Harvard that was being given, a very unusual seminar. The first Yiddish classes ever taught at Harvard were taught by the great Yiddish poet Chaim Grada, one of the great Yiddish poets and prose writers. And Grada was giving a series of seminars on Eastern European Jewish thought, which actually inspired me to my dissertation topic back then, 30 years ago. But at the end of his first seminar, Grada came over to the graduate students and said, "Is this Harry Wolfson's library?" And indeed it was. There's a room on the top of Widener Library, Widener G. It's a well-known room, and it contains the library, the private library of the great Harry Wolfson of Harvard, who wrote this 2-volume study, The Philosophy of Spinoza. And Grada said, "Where are the Spinoza books?" That's all he was interested in seeing. And I soon discovered that Grada was in fact obsessed with Spinoza, and as was his nemesis and main rival, Isaac Bashevis Singer, who wrote the famous story Spinoza of Market Street. Many of you are nodding your heads, yes. And of course, who had a lifelong interest in Spinoza, who wrote many articles in the Yiddish press about Spinoza under a variety of pseudonyms, including Warshawski, Yitzhak Warshawski, which was one of his pseudonyms. Now, Grada's interest in Spinoza was something about which he never published. And I'm beginning to fear that I'm following in his footsteps. But it was a lifelong, fascination and an intense interest, an incredible understanding of, in his own way, of Spinoza's philosophy. 26 years later, I was sitting in a different library, a Hebrew University in Givat Ram, in the National Library, as it's known, the Israel National Library, and my former colleague from my years at McGill, Professor Ruth Weiss, who teaches Yiddish literature at Harvard, came over to me with a letter that she found while going through Melech Ravich's archives. And I know that Dr. Schwartz is going to be talking about Melech Ravich a bit also, so I'm not going to go into much detail about that. But Melech Ravich was a great lyric poet, Yiddish poet, and a very prolific memoirist and author who is also obsessed with Spinoza and who considered himself a Spinozist. His personal faith, he always used to say, "My God is the God of Spinoza," as did most famously Albert Einstein. Now, Ruth Weiss presented me with a letter that Chaim Grada wrote to Melech Ravich. And it's with that text that I want to begin. It's a fascinating letter for all kinds of reasons, both for intellectual reasons and for psychological reasons. Grada was recovering from an illness, and I don't know what the illness was, but he was in the White Plains Rehabilitation Center, and the year was 1963. He was still a relatively young man, in his maybe early 50s. And he wrote a letter to Melech Ravich, who was living in Montreal, And it's not clear what the purpose of the letter is beyond just aggravating Ravitch and maybe putting him in a hospital. So it's in many ways, it's a quintessentially Yiddish letter. A letter of aggravation. And he writes to Ravitch, and he starts bragging to Ravitch. He begins by saying, you know, I got your volume on, I was looking at your volume of poems about Spinoza. One of Ravitch's first published works was a series of poems about Baruch Spinoza. And fascinating poems in which he imagines Spinoza resurrected from the dead. And that's the theme I'm going to focus on today, the resurrection of Spinoza. And instead of discussing his response to the poems, he begins rather to brag about his own expertise on Spinoza. And he writes the following, and you're going to have to forgive me, but I'm going to quote some things in the Yiddish original. It's Yivo. There has to be some Yiddish in the program, and so, or at least that's my theory. And so, but I will translate or summarize whatever for those who don't understand Yiddish. Wer von euch versteht nicht kein Yiddish? That's a trick question. Okay, no one. Okay. All right. Okay, I see people translating already to their neighbors. Very good. Okay, this may take a while. Okay. So Grada writes, Mein Weib hat mir gebracht a hiebschen Teil von mein Spinoza-Bibliothek. My wife just brought me a significant portion of my Spinoza library, my Spinozana, to the hospital. Azoi, wie ich kenn nicht kein Latin, habe ich gelehnt dem Traktat in 4 Lashonis, 4 Sprachen, und die Ethik in noch mehr. Since I don't know Latin, this is the modest part of the letter, I read the Tractatus, the TTP, the Theological Political Treatise, in 4 different languages, and the ethics in more. Could be up to 7 or 8. He doesn't say how many more. And then he goes on to say, I've got the best books about Spinoza in the world. I've got Klatskin, I've got Wolfson, I've got Freudenthal, and he starts talking about all the titles he owns. And then Grada concludes by saying, how could you write those loving, glorifying poems about Spinoza? I mean, how could you, write so beautifully and, so lovingly of him? Hat ihr das keinmal nicht gesehen, als Spinoza ist gewesen der größte Antisemit in der jiddische Geschichte? This is a quote. Did you not know? Did you not notice? They're saying, did you not perhaps notice when you were reading the treatise, and this goes to the question that we were discussing earlier today, that this man was the worst anti-Semite in Jewish history. And if you're going to ask me, Melech Ravitch, the letter actually goes into a whole fictitious argument that Ravitch is giving him, So he says, and if you tell me, Ravitch, that how could he be an anti-Semite? He's a Jew. Toisvus rekta kasha. I know the answer to that. The answer to that, that's an old question, right? All the rabbis ask that question, that a Jew can be the worst anti-Semite, worse than any Gentile. Okay. So that's the letter, and he goes on and on about what a terrible person Spinoza was. And then yours, Chaim Grada. Charming. And then there's a P.S., of course. Ravitch, he writes, Ravitch, and all the Yiddish writers call themselves by their second names. There were no first names. So, Ravitch, by a Gelegenheit, bitte schreib mir welche Bücher ihr hat wegen Spinoza. After giving him hell for writing the Spinoza poems, in adoration of Spinoza, he says, oh, by the way, when you have a chance, send me a bibliographic list of all the books you have about Spinoza. He wanted to make sure he had all of them plus a few more. So clearly there's a kind of strange, twisted, and conflicted interest in Spinoza. Grada was a proud Jew, a Zionist, a fervent Zionist, and yet fascinated, obsessed, one might say, in a kind of strange love relationship with Spinoza, and yet he openly derided Ravitch for honoring Spinoza with his poems, saying that Spinoza is a terrible anti-Semite. Many years later, just a year before his death, in 1979, Grada was interviewed by Rabbi William Berkowitz, who does these, many of you may know, he does these interviews. I don't remember what they were called, but he used to do series. What? Dialogues, yes, the dialogues, yes. He had a dialogue with Chaim Grada in English and Yiddish. And in 2003, for some reason, the Allgemeiner Journal, the Brooklyn-based Yiddish weekly paper, published the dialogues. Now, we all know that the Yiddish press can be late with the news, but this is really, flash. And so there's this dialogue between Berkowitz and Grade. And Berkowitz begins with his favorite question that he asks all of his guests, and that is, if there are three men in Jewish history that you could ask to be resurrected, that you could meet with, who would they be? And Grade says, he says, from what centuries? He says, well, let's say the last 3 centuries. So Grade says, okay, 17th, 18th, 19th. 17th, Spinoza. 18th, the Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism. 19th, Theodor Herzl. Why Spinoza? And he goes on to say, because Spinoza, der Heretiker, der Muchram, wenn man hat reingelegt in Cherem, the heretic, the excommunicant, der selber hat azoya takirt the Neviim, Chazal, and the Rambam, gläubt in Achdus HaBoirei. The Spinoza who attacked the prophets, the Neviim, Chazal, the sages of the Talmud, and the Rambam, Maimonides, he had the true belief in Achdus HaBoirei, in the unity of God, the true unity of God. Das heißt, as der größer Heretiker is gewesen, leut mein Abschatz, that means that according to my assessment, Spinoza was, und nicht bloß mein Abschatz, according to me, and not only me, but many others, auf den Grund und Sachakol von alle seine philosophische Reintrachtungen, a guter Jid, was hat geglebt in absolut Achdus HaBoirei, oder wie man ruft es, Pantheism. This goes to all the questions that were raised earlier today. So Grade says, and it's fascinating because he's talking to a different crowd. He's not writing a private letter to a fellow traveler, a fellow heretic like Melech Rabich, who, by the way, was such a heretic that when his son, who's the great Israeli painter Yossel Bergner, was born, he refused to let him be circumcised. And they had to kidnap Yossel from the house and bring him to the shtetl where his grandfather lived to be circumcised. And when Rabich died, he left strict instructions that he didn't want to be buried according to Jewish law, but to be cremated. And that's what happened. He was cremated. So he was a true Spinozist, and he did have some hate in his heart for rabbinical Judaism. That's certain. And Grade was very different. So Grade oscillates, and here he says very clearly that Spinoza's concept of God is the true concept of God. It's the real Jewish concept of God. It's Achdus HaBoirei. Professor Smith told the story about Borei Olam, where is the creator of the world. Well, for Grade, Spinoza's pantheism, the way he understood it, is true monotheism. It's the ultimate form of Jewish monotheism. Now, it's impossible to know which of these Spinoza believed, Grade believed, or both. Maybe he believed that Spinoza had the perfect conception of the biblical doctrine of monotheism, the true hero Israel, the Lord is one. And actually, in his book, Spinoza's Book of Life, Professor Smith suggests much the same about the relationship to the hero Israel and Spinoza's monism. It's an interesting question. To what extent did Grade believe that you can be both a really good Jew, the smartest of all Jews, and an anti-Semite? I'll leave it at that. And I won't take any questions to answer that question. Now, I very quickly learned, and it wasn't very hard to learn when I came to YIVO, that there was an entire library of Yiddish literature about Spinoza. And one of the strangest themes to emerge from that literature is the notion that Spinoza is resurrected. The very question that Rabbi Berkowitz asked Chaim Grade is a question that comes up in Yiddish literature over and again. I'm not going to go into the poems of Melech Ravitch, but they are absolutely remarkable. And even more remarkable is the genesis of that poetry. Ravitch wrote the poems while he was serving in the army in the First World War, and he claims to have written them while on his knees in a church in a Hungarian town. So it's a very bizarre story. He talks about the Cherem. He has a poem called Die Wärter von Cherem, but most importantly is this notion that comes out of Melech Ravitch's Spinoza poems, published in 1919 in Vienna, if you're bibliographs, that Spinoza's spirit has lived on after his body, that Spinoza's soul is an eternal one, and in fact that's what distinguishes him from other people, from normal people, and from trees, for example. So that's a very specific reference. So Ravitch talks about Spinoza's spirit having been condemned to eternity by the words of the Cherem. Since that day, since the day that he was excommunicated, he has walked in eternity, he writes. And let me just read one selection. Whenever Spinoza tries to go back to his cursed viper's nest, we, the rabbis, this is written in the name of the rabbis, will never forgive him, and God's forgiveness too will be withheld from Spinoza. Quite the contrary, the Lord's wrath will rise higher and higher, until finally we will stone him with our curses and constantly, eternally add more stones to his prison cell from the Bible's books. The stones will be coming out of the Bible's books. Now, of course, like all poetry, it's totally lost in translation, but the Yiddish is Festungsturm, prison cell, and Chumash Svurim, and Chumash Svarim. And Svurim, it only works if you're a Galicianer like Ravitch. Svarim, it wouldn't rhyme. These poems are absolutely remarkable. The last poem, the final poem in the book, reads as follows. This quiet man of the book opens wide the heavenly door and addresses all four of the world's winds. World, I command you. And the world responds to Spinoza, I am not ready. And so he disappears into the winds to await his time. This is Spinoza as a messianic figure, as someone who is waiting to redeem the world with his true notion of redemption, of salvation. And now Ravitch was enthralled by the ethics, enthralled by the idea that one can attain salvation, whatever that means, or eternity, through a correct conception of God. And he therefore imagined that since Spinoza was the only one who understood himself, I mean, who could, we're still scholars, I mean, over lunch we had graduate students and scholars debating the question of how to understand Spinoza's concept of the eternity of the mind. This is an old question. Clearly, no one really knows for sure. Scholars are bitterly divided on what Spinoza meant when he said part of the mind is eternal. And there's a very famous outbreak by one of the great analytic scholars who wrote about Spinoza, Bennett. He comments on Spinoza's suggestion that the mind is eternal. We heard from Stephen Nadler earlier today that Spinoza rejected immortality of the soul. But the question is, what about a form of eternity, of intellectual eternity? Well, Bennett wrote when he got to this proposition, and one can imagine after years of toiling away at explaining the ethics, he was tired and maybe a little aggravated. And he writes about this proposition, commenting on Spinoza's suggestion that a piece of the mind remains eternal. He writes, and it's towards the very end, I think it's the third to last proposition in the ethics where he makes it explicit. He says, this proposition is an unmitigated and seemingly unmotivated disaster. It's rubbish that causes others to write more rubbish. After 3 centuries of failure to profit whatever from it, the time has finally come to admit that this part of the ethics is utterly worthless. And he goes on and on. It sounds like he's having a nervous breakdown. And this is really a maddening theme. But one thing is certain, and perhaps this is what Spinoza meant. Spinoza's memory has been reincarnated time and time again, and not least by Yiddish writers. The second example of this is the parody by their Tunkler, Joseph Tunkel, called Baruch Spinoza in Varsha. Baruch Spinoza comes to Warsaw. Now, der Tunkler devoted much of his writing to deflate through his parodies. He was a great parodist and satirist, and the editor of der Größer Kundis, this comedic magazine, cartoon magazine that appeared it's kind of like the Jewish version of a spy magazine in England that appeared for many years here in New York City. Unfortunately, he died very young and a tragic death, but der Tunkler used his humor to deflate some of the egotism and the arrogance of the interwar Yiddish intelligentsia. You know, the great writers and thinkers, the Schreibers and Machabrim in Warsaw and Vilna, he loved to write about them and make fun of them. No Yiddish writer, no political thinker, no essayist, no poet, and this includes Hebrew, public Jewish intellectuals, escaped der Tunkler's wit. A favorite target of der Tunkler were newspaper editors and their respective, often rigid, and all too seriously held ideologies and editorial pages. In his dream fantasy, Baruch Spinoza in Varsha, Fragmenten von a Cholam, Baruch Spinoza comes to Warsaw, Fragments of a Dream, which appeared in 1927, the same year that Joseph Klausner got up on Mount Scopus and rescinded the excommunication, as we heard earlier today, was included in a collection of essays called A Gelächter on a Zeit, Laughing on the Side, Warsaw 1920, or Laughing from the Sidelines. Der Tunkler employs the image of Spinoza, the famously cool and cautious rationalist thinker, caught up in an insane asylum of interwar Yiddish Warsaw competing ideologies. And he uses Spinoza, the figure of a resurrected Spinoza who arrives in Warsaw in 1927 amidst all the tumult of this, this very exciting period in Jewish intellectual history in Eastern Europe, to take potshots at just about every one of the reigning ideologies of his day. The first target is poor Melech Ravitch again. Again, forgive me just for quoting just a little from the Yiddish original, just to give you a flavor of it. It begins like this. As Baruch Spinoza is abgelegen schon 250 Jahre in Kever, hat sich miyashiv gewein, as soll liegen is kentachles nicht. Man muss einmal aufstehen, zu chappen a Cook, was ist gewein mit der Unsterblichkeit? As Baruch Spinoza had been lying in the grave for 300 years, this was the tercentenary celebration, of course, that Professor Smith spoke about on a more philosophical vein. Baruch Spinoza was lying in his grave for 300 years, and he thought, how do you say miyashiv gevein? He came to the conclusion that to lie like this has no tachlis. It's not tachlitic, we would say in English. There's no point. No point just lying around. I may as well go and see what's happening in the eternal world, the Unsterblichkeit, in the world of eternal souls. It's a very poignantly chosen phrase. And so he goes and he gets up and he's in The Hague, a Goyish Stadt. It has nothing to do there. He goes to Amsterdam. Amsterdam has a great Jewish community. He wasn't impressed. He asked around. They said, you want Jews? Go to Warsaw. So he goes to Warsaw, but he doesn't have the money to pay for the train ticket. So he decides to write a letter to Melech Ravitch. And he writes to Ravitch, and he basically says to Ravitch, here's how the letter begins. Teurer Ravitch, dear Ravitch, wie ich hab gehört, hast du nicht koshedik arufgearbeitet in mein Schuss. I've heard you've made quite a good living on using my name. You saw the poster of the lecture, right? Ravitch is running around giving lectures about Spinoza. How about paying for a train ticket so I could come to Warsaw? So he says, I'm stuck here in Amsterdam. I'm going to, for the sake of time, just condense here. He basically is asking him for the money for train fare to get from Amsterdam to Warsaw. And the answer comes, Spinoza, a Schod, a größer Schod, was du hast nicht gewendet zu mir mit ein Jahr früher. Wir wollten gekonnt kaufen bei dir Artikeln für der Warschauer Schriften. Oh, it's a shame you didn't contact me a year earlier. I could have bought from you some of your material for the journal that I edit. Aber jetzt bei uns ist du ein Überfluss von Gästen. Jabotinsky, Shmaryahu Levin, Chernyakhovsky, Bistrisky, Grossman, Bialik. There are so many guests here. We've got Bialik coming, we've got Chernyakhovsky coming, we got all the great Jewish you should have contacted me earlier. I can't help you. Anyway, Spinoza manages to find another way to get himself to Warsaw. And he's wandering around the streets of Warsaw. He doesn't know what to do with himself. And then he sees a placard announcing a conference on Spinoza. I'm not making this up, by the way. I think Paul has read the satire. It's an amazing piece of work. And he says, in the Abend geht zu hören Referaten wegen Spinoza. In the evening, he decided to go hear some lectures. Spinoza decides to go hear some lectures about himself. Ist gesessen, gehört und gekneitscht mit den Plätzes. Spinoza allein hat gehört, als was man hat gerät wegen Spinoza, aber nicht verstanden ein Wort, was man redt. Nicht benommen mit seinem schwachen Meuch. He's listening to everything, these lectures, these great philosophers and scholars are giving lectures about Spinoza. He doesn't understand what the hell they're talking about. Not a word. Anyway, he decides to ask a question, like all of you like to do. And he says, he gets up and he tries to correct one of the speakers for misconstruing one of his central doctrines. It's about thought and extension. The details are not important. I leave that to the professional philosophers here. The chairman, the Vorsitzer, the chairman of the panel says, Ruhig, Panya Spinoza, quiet down Spinoza, Panya Spinoza, Mr. Spinoza, Ruhig, ihr seid schon 250 Jahre Scheuchenoffer. You've been lying in the dust for 250 years. Ihr habt schon vergessen, was ihr habt gesagt. You're an old man. You don't remember what you said. And you haven't kept up with the scholarship, obviously. I added that. Als unser Warschauer Doktor sagt, as is azoi, when one of our doctorates, someone with a doctorate in Warsaw says, this is what you meant, that's the way it is. Anyway, the story goes on, but the basic script is that Spinoza is starving to death because he can't get work in Warsaw. No one wants to employ him. He tries to get his works published. No one's interested in publishing the Ethics. The editors look at it and says it's unreadable. So he decides to serialize, because, you know, the Yiddish writers all serialize their stories. So he decides to serialize the theological political treatise and to sell it a chapter at a time to various Yiddish weeklies and dailies. And so he goes from one to the other, and the descriptions of his encounters with the Yiddish press editors are absolutely remarkable. And each weekly corresponds to one of the Warsaw or Yiddish dailies or weeklies. So, for example, he first goes, the first stop is an Orthodox journal called Der Yarmulke. And the editors of the Yarmulke refuse to employ Spinoza unless he agrees to publicly rescind all of his heresies by writing. They said they'll publish one chapter of the theological political treatise for each pamphlet, each polemic he's willing to write gegen die Zionisten und andere Apikorsim ymach shmam, against the Zionists and other heretics, may their names be blotted out. So that obviously is not going to work. And so the next weekly he goes to is the editorial offices of a journal called Der Nachtigentag. The Tag was a famous New York daily newspaper, and this is a Nachtigentag. Yeah, I cannot translate it. I just can't. Yesterday's day. You know what a Nachtigentag is the equivalent of Bronx. Forget about it, right? It's forget about it. So he goes, and the editors discover that the TTP, and now the Nachtigentag, like the Tag really was in New York, a Zionist paper, a Zionist-oriented paper. And so when the editors at the Nachtigentag realize that Spinoza does not deal at all in the theological political treatise with the importance of the Jewish agency and its political agenda, they refuse to publish him. And from the Nachtigentag, he goes to another paper called the Horapachnik, the Workers' Daily, and from there, finally, and I'll go to the end of the satire, he arrives at the office of the Scandal Sheet, where he finally gets a very warm reception. By the way, all of the newspapers who throw him out and refuse to hire him or to publish his stuff, to serialize his material, all of them, in the following issue of the paper, have a a banner headline on the front page: Baruch Spinoza visits the editorial offices of the Nachtigentag. So they all They all boast about his presence. He came to consult with us, the great Spinoza. Nechten bei uns ist gewesen der größer Philosoph Baruch Spinoza. He came to discuss certain matters with our editors, and we were very helpful to him. Anyway, finally he arrives at the editorial office of the Reiter Springer, the red grasshopper, right? The red grasshopper, and this is a scandal sheet. This is like, you know, this is like Star Magazine or one of those tabloids, right? National Enquirer kind of thing. And they decide to do a story about Spinoza's appearance. And here's how the story goes. And with this, I'm going to end. I don't know if I'm going to end my lecture, or am I going to end my lecture? How's the time? A few more minutes? Okay. So I'll mention one or two other satires in the same genre, or one or two other versions of imagining Spinoza come back from the dead. Here's how it goes. Headline in the Reiter Springer, in case you missed the issue. Noch 250 Jahre tot, zurück lebendig geworden. After 250 years dead, a man was resurrected. His name is Spinoza. Reingenommen in Chereb zu lieb viel Weiberschaft. He was originally excommunicated, and Professor Nadler did not touch on this point, because of polygamy, viel Weiberschaft. Big love, you know. A Schleifer von falscher Gläselach, Brillantin in Warschau. He has ever since then been a counterfeit diamond maker in Warsaw. Again, if Spinoza was a lens grinder, they turned him into a counterfeit, a kind of gypsy diamond maker. Okay. And here's the article. Nechten hat sich in unserer Redaktie Reiter Springer, wo es schwibbelt und gribbelt tagtäglich mit Millionen interessanten Beweisen a paar Schein mit dem Namen Baruch Spinoza. Yesterday in our editorial offices, where it's tumult, it's always busy, and there's thousands of people coming and going all the time, someone by the name of Baruch Spinoza arrived. Welcher is gelebt 200 Jahre in Hinner... okay, let me go on. Okay. He had many wives. He was kicked out of the community. He was kidnapped by gypsies, and then ran away with a beautiful young girl by the name of Amalia von Kremenitz. Welche hat geboren von Spinoza a Kind mit zwei Keppelach, who gave birth to a son with two heads. Eins ein menschliches und der zweiten von Kreut. One from cabbage and one human head. Der menschliche Keppel hat aufgegessen das Keppelkreuz und als auf a romantische Boden, the human head devoured the cabbage head, but in a very romantic way. The Shena Amalia hat, okay, it goes on. Spinoza hat der Sehen, the story ends, Spinoza hat der Sehen, als kann gar nicht machen in Warschau, ist weggefahren zurück in Holland und sich zurück umgekehrt zu sein Eberkeru. At the end of the story, Spinoza sees there's nothing for him in Warsaw, and he goes back to his eternal rest in Holland. Now, what's the purpose of this story? The purpose of the story is to make fun of people who take themselves too seriously as experts on Spinoza, and when they're really amateur philosophers, unlike our panelists today. I hasten to add, but I mean, in Warsaw, you had all kinds of interesting characters, all self-taught autodidacts writing and publishing about Spinoza. I'll mention I'll just mention two other incidents of this phenomenon of Spinoza imagined resurrected from the dead. There are many. One is a serious book, actually a very serious book, a Hebrew book that was written by Dov Ber Turish, and it's called Sichat Neshamot, the discussion of souls, Kol Spinoza Mikivro. The voice of Spinoza speaks from the grave. And it begins with this fantasy that Spinoza, Saul Mortera, who was one of the rabbis who hounded Spinoza, is walking around the cemetery, the New Church Cemetery in The Hague, and he's looking for Spinoza's grave, and he finds it, and he starts hitting on the grave. Spinoza comes up, and they get into a philosophical discussion, and for the next 200 pages, Spinoza renounces and argues against everything he affirmed, both in the Ethics and the Tractatus, beginning with the idea that there is only one substance. And this is a very serious refutation of all of Spinoza's belief, but put in his own words. And this is a text that I've actually studied very closely because it's incredible how accurately Tursch clearly understood, at least according to my, as Grade would say, Leut mein Obschatz, according to my estimation, he really understood Spinoza. He imagined Spinoza being a Baal Tshuva, being a penitent Jew, revoking his heresies, but not only that, the amusing part about this particular piece of literature is that in the context of doing that, he also criticizes all the Hebrew and Yiddish writers who've written books about Spinoza. So Spinoza himself goes after Klatskin and goes after Sokolov and goes after all the Yiddish writers and Hebrew writers who've written books, and Freudenthal. He goes after all those who've written kindly about him. And he says, I'm such a terrible person. Why are these Jews writing nice things about me? I'm a heretic. Okay. So that's one very serious book. And then there's a very serious series of poems, not that Ravitch's aren't, by Leivik. Some say Leivik was the greatest Yiddish poet of all times. He certainly was one of the most influential and popular Yiddish poets. And Leivik has a remarkable series of poems called Lieder von Gan Eden, poems from the Garden of Eden. And in this series of poems, he has a series of 11 poems about Spinoza. And it's subtitled Spinoza. It's a section of the book. And it begins with, now, Lieder von Gan Eden was written in this same period, 1932. And in 1932, Leivik was in a sanatorium in Denver, Colorado for tuberculosis. We have to keep in mind that Spinoza died of some unspecified lung disease. Leivik imagined that he had the same disease as Spinoza. And he's lying in bed, and he's reading the ethics in the sanatorium. And this is a very actually common, something I keep coming across. Yiddish writers reading the ethics, reading it in German, reading it in Yiddish translation. The ethics was translated into Yiddish. All of Spinoza's writings were translated into Yiddish and Hebrew. And the nurse comes in and takes the ethics out of his hand and says, you have to sleep, Mr. Leivik. He doesn't want to sleep. He wants to stay up all night and read the ethics. Leivik was a partier even when he didn't feel well. And so he's reading the ethics, and the nurse finally says, no, you must go to sleep. And she closes the lights, and he writes the following. Ich reiß die Augen auf von Cholmen zu oft. Leben mir is a neuer Guf. Spinoza liegt und schlaft. I lie down, I close my eyes, but I can't sleep, so I open my eyes, and next to me there's a new body. Spinoza is lying next to me in bed. And he asks Spinoza, wie kommt her in Krankenkammer der Philosoph, der Amsterdamer? How do you come to the hospital, to the sick bed, the Amsterdam philosopher? It doesn't work in translation. Krankenkammer, Philosoph, Amsterdamer. And it goes on. Spinoza tells him why he's come back to the land of the living. He's come back to redeem the world. And the subsequent 9 poems are absolutely remarkable. They're very similar. For those of you who know Leivik, he has that very powerful poem called Wolf, where a rabbi turns into a kind of werewolf and prowls around and takes retribution on all of the sinners. Here Spinoza becomes a werewolf, becomes a wolf-like, a Wolverine figure, and starts prowling the countryside, taking vengeance on all those who tormented him and persecuted in his lifetime, and in a kind of almost a kind of terrorist for truth, running around the world and making havoc in order to hasten the redemption. And as different as these poems are from Ravitch's, they share that one theme, that Spinoza is not only immortal, he not only comes back to life, he not only has, by way of extension, something to teach us all in our day and age, but he is a messianic figure, that ultimately redemption will come only through Spinoza's method. And Spinoza, of course, one can make the argument that Spinoza is interested in eternal life, or at least attaining a type of eternity, going back to that vexing theme, living under the species of eternity. It's not a good translation of the Latin, but living eternally even while occupying a body in this life. Perhaps that's what Spinoza meant by eternal life. But one thing is clear. These Yiddish writers who read Spinoza, who even when they were sick were reading Spinoza as bedtime material, not only revered Spinoza, but saw his philosophy as having the potential for salvation. in very troubled times in Jewish history. I mean, the interwar period was a very turbulent and confusing and difficult time. Spinoza was an anchor of stability. His serenity was seen as a model for them, and his sense of confidence that he had found the truth was seen as a model in an age in which truth was so uncertain and there was so much danger around every corner, especially for Europe's Jews. And so Spinoza lives on eternally and is a beacon of hope and ultimately a messianic figure in so many examples of Yiddish literature. There are more, but I should conclude now, and I thank you for